I thought the bruises were from soccer. I didn't ask enough questions until it was too late. My son Oliver was 9 when he started coming home with marks on his arms. Small things at first, just little red spots I noticed when he was changing for bed. He said he fell during recess and I believed him because kids fall all the time. The next week there were more bruises on his ribs, and when I asked about them he said he got hit with a soccer ball during PE. His teacher Mrs. Henderson hadn't mentioned anything in her weekly emails, so I figured it was just normal playground stuff. Oliver was always a quiet kid, small for his age with these big brown eyes that made him look younger than he was. He'd rather read than play sports and got picked last for teams, but I thought that was just part of growing up. The bruises kept appearing though. One on his shoulder blade that looked like fingerprints. A dark purple one on his thigh that he tried to hide when getting out of the bath. When I pressed him about it, he got defensive and said I was being paranoid. He started wearing long sleeves even when it was warm outside. I emailed Mrs. Henderson asking if everything was okay at school, and she responded that Oliver seemed fine, maybe a little withdrawn but nothing concerning. She suggested he might benefit from joining the chess club to make more friends. I signed him up and he went twice before saying he didn't want to go anymore because the other kids called him names. That should have been a bigger red flag, but I was working full-time as a nurse and Oliver's dad had left when he was 3, so it was just us managing everything. I was tired all the time and Oliver was generally well behaved, so when he said he was fine I wanted to believe him. My mom kept saying I was being overprotective and that boys got rough with each other sometimes. She said I needed to let him toughen up instead of babying him. So I backed off a little even though something in my gut felt wrong. Oliver started having nightmares around October. He'd wake up crying but wouldn't tell me what they were about. His grades dropped from S to CS and Mrs. Henderson finally requested a parent-teacher conference. When I went in she said Oliver seemed distracted and wasn't participating in class discussions anymore. He'd stopped raising his hand and spent lunch period in the library instead of the cafeteria. She thought maybe he was having trouble adjusting to 4th grade or dealing with his father's absence. I explained that his dad had been gone for years and this was new behavior. Mrs. Henderson nodded and made some notes but didn't offer any real solutions beyond suggesting I have him evaluated by the school counselor. I scheduled the counselor appointment, but they were booked out 3 weeks. In the meantime, Oliver started complaining of stomach aches every morning before school. He'd sit at the kitchen table pushing his cereal around the bowl looking miserable. Some mornings he'd throw up and I'd let him stay home because I thought he was actually sick. This happened maybe 5 or 6 times in November until the school sent me a letter about his attendance. The letter said absences were affecting his education, and if it continued they'd have to involve a truancy officer. I felt like the worst mother in the world because I'd been trying to help him and now I was being threatened with legal action. The counselor session finally happened in early December. Oliver went in alone and came out 30 minutes later looking exactly the same. The counselor Mrs. Palmer pulled me aside and said Oliver was reluctant to open up but she'd scheduled follow-up sessions. She mentioned he seemed anxious and might benefit from some coping strategies for stress. I asked if she thought something was happening at school and she said kids his age often struggled with social dynamics but it was developmentally normal. She gave me a pamphlet about childhood anxiety and sent us on our way. Things got worse after Thanksgiving break. Oliver begged not to go back to school, actually got down on his knees in the hallway crying and holding onto my legs. I was already running late for my shift at the hospital and I didn't know what to do. I told him he had to go, that we'd talk about it later, that everything would be okay. He looked at me with these defeated eyes and stopped crying. Just went completely quiet and walked to the car. That silence scared me more than the crying had, but I was already 20 minutes late and my supervisor had warned me about tardiness. So I dropped him off and watched him walk into the building with his shoulders hunched and his backpack dragging. Around 1 p.m. that day I got a call from the school nurse saying Oliver had an accident on the playground. My heart stopped and I asked what kind of accident. She said he'd fallen from the monkey bars and hit his head and they wanted me to pick him up to be safe even though he seemed okay. I left work immediately and signed out at the front office where the secretary barely looked up from her computer. The nurse brought Oliver out and he had a small bandage on his forehead. She said he should ice it and watch for concussion symptoms. Oliver wouldn't look at me the whole drive home. At a tea home I made him lie down on the couch and brought him ice wrapped in a towel. I asked what happened and he said he slipped. I asked if anyone pushed him and he said no. But his hands were shaking when he held the ice pack and he kept staring at the wall. I sat with him for a while before I had to make dinner and when I came back he was asleep. That night I checked on him every 2 hours like you're supposed to with head injuries and each time he was awake staring at the ceiling. The next morning he refused to get out of bed. I tried everything from bribing him with his favorite breakfast to threatening to take away his iPad. Nothing worked. He just laid there with the blankets over his head. I ended up calling in sick to work and spending the day trying to figure out what was wrong. He wouldn't eat or talk or move. Around 3 p.m. he finally got up to use the bathroom and when he came back he sat on the edge of his bed and told me 3 boys in his class had been hurting him since September. He said their names were Jaden, Marcus, and Tyler. They'd started by calling him names like crybaby and loser. Then they began tripping him in the hallway and taking his lunch. It escalated to them cornering him in the bathroom and punching him where the bruises wouldn't show. They told him if he told anyone they'd make it worse. The monkey bars incident wasn't an accident. They'd pushed him off and told the teacher on duty that he fell. Oliver said he tried to tell Mrs. Henderson once, but she was busy grading papers and told him to work it out with the other boys himself. She said conflicts were learning opportunities, that I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. All those bruises I dismissed. All those times he'd tried to tell me something was wrong in his own way. I'd failed him completely by not pushing harder. I asked why he didn't tell me, and he said he thought I'd be disappointed in him for not being strong enough to handle it. That broke something inside me. I held him while he cried and promised I'd fix this. I said he never had to go back to that school again if he didn't want to. He asked if I meant it, and I said yes, even though I had no idea how I'd manage homeschooling while working full-time. The next day I went to the school to talk to the principal. I had to wait 45 minutes past my scheduled appointment because she was dealing with another situation. When I finally got in, she was polite but dismissive. She asked if Oliver had any proof of the bullying besides his word. I said he had bruises, and she said kids got bruises all the time from playing. I mentioned that he'd named specific students, and she said she couldn't discipline children based on accusations without evidence. I asked about the bathroom incidents, and she said there were no cameras in the bathrooms for privacy reasons. She suggested Oliver might be struggling to make friends and misinterpreting normal social interactions as bullying. I could feel my face getting hot. I told her my son was being assaulted and she was making excuses. She got defensive and said the school took all allegations seriously but had to follow proper procedures. She said she'd talked to the boys and their parents but couldn't promise any specific disciplinary action. I asked what Oliver was supposed to do in the meantime, and she said they could move him to a different lunch period and have him check in with the counselor weekly. That was her big solution. Different lunch and more counseling. Nothing about protecting him or holding the other kids accountable. That I kept Oliver home for the rest of that week while I figured out what to do. I called the district office and got transferred 4 times before reaching someone in student services who took my report and said they'd investigate. The investigation consisted of the principal interviewing the 3 boys who all denied everything and their parents who all said their sons would never do such things. Jaden's mother even called me directly to accuse Oliver of lying to get attention. She said her son was an honor student and athlete who'd never been in trouble. I told her my son had bruises, and she said that didn't prove anything. She hung up on me when I started crying from frustration. The district investigator called me 2 weeks later to say they couldn't substantiate the bullying claims. There was no video evidence, no witnesses willing to come forward, and the accused students denied involvement. The investigator suggested we work on Oliver's conflict resolution skills and consider that he might be misunderstanding social cues. She said some children were more sensitive than others and needed extra support learning to navigate peer relationships. I asked what I was paying taxes for if the school wouldn't protect my kid, and she said she understood my frustration, but their hands were tied without concrete evidence. Oliver heard me on that phone call. He was supposed to be doing homework in his room, but he'd come out to get water and stood in the hallway listening. After I hung up, he asked if that meant nothing was going to happen to those boys. I didn't know what to tell him, so I just said we'd figure it out. He went back to his room and didn't come out for dinner. When I checked on him later, he was under his covers with a flashlight reading. He asked if I still believed him, and I said of course I did. He said okay, but he didn't sound convinced, and I started looking into other schools, but we were locked into our district based on our address. Private school wasn't affordable on my salary. Homeschooling would mean quitting my job and we'd lose our health insurance. I felt trapped by circumstances and guilty that my financial situation was forcing Oliver to stay in an unsafe environment. My mom said I was being dramatic and that kids dealt with bullies all the time without their parents interfering. She said I was teaching Oliver to be a victim by coddling him. We didn't speak for a month after that conversation. Oliver went back to school in January after winter break. I'd worked out a safety plan with Mrs. Henderson where Oliver could leave class anytime he felt unsafe and go to the counselor's office. The first day back, he used this pass 6 times. Mrs. Henderson emailed me saying this was disruptive to her teaching and the other students. She suggested Oliver might not be ready to return to school and should consider extended medical leave. I read that email at 11 p.m. after a 12-hour shift and threw my phone across the room. The breaking point came in February on a day I wasn't even supposed to be working but got called in to cover someone's shift. Oliver had told me that morning he didn't feel safe at school and I'd promised I'd pick him up early. But I got stuck at the hospital with a patient crisis and couldn't leave. I texted Oliver's teacher asking her to keep an eye on him, and she responded with a thumbs up emoji. At 2:30, the school nurse called saying Oliver had been found locked in a storage closet during the final period of the day. He was having a panic attack and couldn't breathe properly. I got to the school at 3:15 and found Oliver in the nurse's office curled up on the vinyl bed. His face was blotchy and tear-streaked. The nurse said someone must have locked him in as a prank, but no one saw who did it. A janitor found him when he heard banging and crying. Oliver had been in there for over an hour in the dark. The nurse said she'd given him breathing exercises and he'd calmed down but should probably go home. She handed me an incident report to sign and I noticed she'd written possible claustrophobia episode under notes instead of anything about bullying or assault, and I changed that to student locked in closet by other students, and she got flustered. She said they didn't actually know it was other students and I was making assumptions. I asked who else would lock a 9-year-old in a closet and she said sometimes doors stuck. The closet was in a back hallway near the boys' bathroom where those 3 boys always hung out. Everyone knew that. But the nurse kept insisting it could have been an accident and I shouldn't jump to conclusions. I took Oliver home and he didn't speak the entire drive. At home he went straight to his room, and when I tried to follow he asked me to please just leave him alone. That I called the police that night. The dispatcher said this was a school matter and I should report it to school administrators first. I said I'd already done that repeatedly and nothing happened. She said without injuries or threats there wasn't much they could do, but I could file a report if I wanted. I filed the report and an officer came to our house 2 days later to take Oliver's statement. Oliver sat on the couch barely speaking above a whisper while the officer wrote things down. The officer was nice enough but kept asking questions that made it sound like Oliver might be exaggerating. Things like, "Are you sure you were locked in, and was the door actually stuck instead of locked?" At the end he said he'd forward the report to the school resource officer who'd look into it. The school resource officer never contacted us. When I called him directly he said he'd spoken to the principal, who indicated this was part of an ongoing situation being handled through proper channels. He couldn't intervene in school disciplinary matters unless there was criminal activity. I asked if locking a child in a closet wasn't criminal, and he said it would be if we could prove who did it and that it was intentional. Otherwise it was considered a school bullying issue which fell under the district's jurisdiction, not his. He gave me the number for the district's bullying hotline, which I'd already called 3 times. Oliver stopped going to school completely in March. I couldn't force him anymore. He'd physically fight me trying to get him out the door, or he'd go and then call me an hour later having a panic attack in the bathroom. The truancy letters started coming weekly. They threatened court involvement and potential custody issues if Oliver's attendance didn't improve. I showed these letters to our pediatrician Dr. Shaw during Oliver's checkup, and she wrote a note saying Oliver was experiencing severe anxiety and depression related to school-based trauma and should be excused from attendance until further notice. That note bought us some time but didn't solve anything. Oliver spent his days in his room playing video games or sleeping. He stopped reading, which had been his favorite thing. He stopped wanting to see his friends from soccer, though that might have been because they went to the same school. He barely ate and lost weight his frame couldn't afford to lose. I took him back to Dr. Shaw, who referred us to a child psychiatrist, but the earliest appointment was 6 weeks out. In the meantime, she prescribed medication for anxiety which made Oliver nauseous, and we had to stop after a week. The child psychiatrist, Dr. Monroe, was a kind woman with a soft voice who specialized in childhood trauma. She diagnosed Oliver with PTSD and severe anxiety disorder. She said what happened to him was serious and the lack of intervention from school had compounded the trauma. She recommended intensive therapy twice a week and possibly medication once we found the right one. She also said Oliver needed to feel safe before he could start healing, and going back to that school wasn't safe. She wrote a detailed letter to the district explaining Oliver's diagnosis and recommending a transfer to a different school or homebound instruction. The district denied the transfer request. Their policy said students could only transfer schools under specific circumstances like moving to a new address or documented physical safety threats. Documented meant police reports resulting in charges or protection orders. Since the police hadn't charged anyone and there were no protection orders, Oliver didn't qualify. The homebound instruction was approved but only provided 5 hours of tutoring per week, which wasn't enough to keep up with his curriculum. The tutor was a retired teacher who came to our house 3 times a week and did her best, but she wasn't equipped to teach every subject. Money became a serious problem. I'd used up all my sick days and PTO staying home with Oliver. I was taking unpaid leave when he had therapy appointments or bad days, which was happening more often. My supervisor pulled me into her office to discuss my attendance and warned me that my job was at risk if things didn't improve. I tried to explain about Oliver and she sympathized but said the hospital needed reliable staff. She couldn't keep accommodating my absences even though she understood my situation. I asked what I was supposed to do and she suggested finding a family member who could help or looking into disability leave, though that wouldn't be paid. My mom finally agreed to help after I broke down crying on her doorstep. She said she still thought I was handling this wrong but couldn't watch us struggle anymore. She started coming over on days I had to work so Oliver wasn't alone. At first Oliver wouldn't come out of his room when she was there, but eventually he started eating lunch with her. She didn't push him to talk about what happened, which was probably good because I'd been pushing too hard trying to help him process everything. Sometimes I'd come home and find them watching cooking shows together, not saying much but at least being in the same room. The 3 boys faced no consequences at school. I found this out when I ran into Jaden's mother at the grocery store. She made a point of telling me how proud she was of Jaden making honor roll and getting selected for the travel soccer team. She said he was such a good kid, always helping others, and she couldn't imagine why Oliver would make up stories about him. I wanted to throw my groceries at her, but instead I just walked away. In my car I sat shaking and crying so hard I couldn't drive for 20 minutes. Dr. Monroe suggested I might need therapy too. She said parents of traumatized children often develop their own trauma responses, and I was showing signs of hypervigilance and emotional dysregulation. I said I didn't have time or money for therapy, and she gave me some free resources online. I tried using them late at night after Oliver went to bed, but mostly I just felt angry and helpless. I'd lie awake replaying everything I should have done differently. I should have pulled him from school the first time he begged me not to go. I should have made more noise earlier. I should have protected him better. Oliver's 10th birthday came and went with just me, my mom, and him eating cake at our kitchen table. He'd asked not to have a party because he didn't want to see anyone from school. I'd ordered him some books he'd been wanting, but he barely looked at them. My mom got him a new video game and he said thank you but didn't open it. Later that night I heard him crying in his room, and when I went in he said he wished he could go back and be braver. He said maybe if he'd fought back or told someone sooner things would be different. I told him none of this was his fault, but I could see he didn't believe me. The lawsuit was my lawyer's idea, not mine. I'd gone to Gerald Mayer just to ask about our options for forcing a school transfer. He listened to everything that happened and said we had grounds for a civil rights violation based on the school's deliberate indifference to known harassment. He explained it would be a long process with no guaranteed outcome, but might be the only way to create real change. The consultation was free, but filing the suit would require a retainer I didn't have. He said he'd take the case on contingency, meaning he only got paid if we won, but I'd still need to cover filing fees and other costs up front, and I took out a loan against my car to cover the initial fees. Gerald filed the complaint in federal court against the school district, the principal, and Mrs. Henderson individually for failing to protect Oliver. The lawsuit outlined every incident, every report I'd made, every time they'd dismissed or minimized what was happening. It included Dr. Monroe's evaluation, Oliver's medical records showing the anxiety and depression, and statements from the police officer and school nurse. Gerald said building the case would take months of depositions and document gathering, but he felt we had strong evidence of institutional failure. The school district's response was to immediately transfer the 3 boys to different schools, citing an unspecified safety concern. This happened 2 weeks after we filed the lawsuit. The principal sent an email to all parents saying the district took student safety seriously and had taken appropriate action in response to recent allegations. She didn't name the students or what they'd done. Jaden's mother posted on Facebook about how her son was being discriminated against and forced to change schools because of false accusations. Her post got 200 likes and dozens of comments from other parents supporting her and saying the school district was caving to unreasonable demands. Oliver's therapy was slowly helping. He'd moved past the stage where he couldn't talk about what happened and was now working on not blaming himself. Dr. Monroe used something called EMDR, where Oliver recalled traumatic memories while following lights with his eyes. It was supposed to help his brain process the trauma differently. After sessions, Oliver was exhausted and needed to sleep. But gradually he started having fewer nightmares. He still wasn't sleeping through the night consistently, but maybe 3 or 4 nights a week he'd make it without waking up crying or calling for me. The deposition process was brutal. I had to sit in a conference room while the district's lawyer asked me questions designed to make me look like an overprotective mother who'd raised an overly sensitive child. She asked about Oliver's relationship with his father and whether the abandonment had affected his emotional stability. She asked if I'd considered that my own anxiety might be influencing Oliver's behavior. She asked why I didn't supervise Oliver's social interactions more closely if I was so concerned about bullying. Gerald objected to some questions, but I still had to answer most of them. I left that deposition feeling like I'd been the one on trial instead of the school district. Oliver had to be deposed too, which Dr. Monroe advised against, but legally we didn't have a choice. They did it at Gerald's office with Dr. Monroe present and lots of breaks built in. The district's lawyer was gentler with Oliver than she'd been with me, but still asked difficult questions. She asked him to describe exactly what happened each time and point to where he was touched on a body diagram. She asked if he'd ever hit any of the boys first or said mean things to them. She asked if he was sure he remembered things correctly or if maybe some of the incidents were blurring together. Oliver held up okay during the deposition but had nightmares for a week after. The district offered a settlement in August. They'd pay $75,000 and agree to implement new anti-bullying protocols if we dropped the lawsuit and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Gerald said this was a lowball offer and we could probably get more if we went to trial. But trial meant Oliver testifying in front of a jury and being cross-examined more aggressively. It meant years of appeals regardless of the outcome. It meant keeping this wound open indefinitely. I asked Oliver what he wanted to do and he said he just wanted it to be over. He said he didn't care about the money or making them admit they were wrong, he just wanted to stop thinking about it. We accepted the settlement with some modifications. The non-disclosure agreement couldn't prevent Oliver from discussing his experience in therapy or with family. The anti-bullying protocols had to include specific training requirements and reporting procedures with quarterly updates to the state education board. The settlement money went into a trust for Oliver's future therapy and education costs. Gerald took his cut, and after fees we had about $45,000 left. It felt like nothing compared to what Oliver had been through, but it was something. The school year started without Oliver. He still couldn't handle being in a classroom with other kids. We'd tried a gradual exposure plan where we just visited empty schools on weekends, but even that was too much. He'd freeze up and start hyperventilating. Dr. Monroe said this might take years to overcome and we shouldn't rush it. She recommended an online school program designed for students with anxiety and trauma. The program was expensive even with the settlement money, but at least Oliver could work at his own pace from home. Oliver seemed to like the online school better. He could do his work in his pajamas and take breaks whenever he needed. He didn't have to worry about anyone cornering him in bathrooms or locking him in closets. His grades started improving, and he even participated in the virtual class discussions sometimes. The program had a social component too, with supervised online group activities, which Oliver tried once and never again. He said the other kids were nice, but he couldn't handle the group interaction. YET.my mom suggested getting Oliver a dog. She'd read somewhere that animals helped with trauma recovery. I was hesitant because of the expense and responsibility, but Oliver's face lit up when she mentioned it. We went to the shelter and Oliver picked out a scruffy terrier mix who'd been abandoned. Oliver named him Scout, and that dog became his constant companion. Scout slept in Oliver's bed and sat next to him during online school and followed him around the house. Having Scout seemed to help Oliver more than anything else had. Things weren't getting better so much as we were learning to live with a new reality. Oliver was still on anxiety medication that he'd probably need for years. He still had therapy twice a week. He still couldn't handle crowds or sudden loud noises or being alone with men he didn't know well. But he was smiling sometimes and sleeping better and starting to talk about things other than what happened. We had a routine that worked even if it looked nothing like what I'd imagined parenting would be. The school district did implement their new protocols. They sent out a survey asking for parent input on bullying prevention and held mandatory training sessions for all staff. They hired an additional school counselor and installed cameras in more hallways. None of this would help Oliver, but maybe it would help other kids. Or maybe it was all for show and nothing would actually change until it happened to someone else and that family fought as hard as we had. I think about those three boys sometimes. Jaden and Marcus and Tyler. They're 11 or 12 now at different schools starting middle school. Maybe they learned something from getting transferred and facing consequences. Or maybe they just got better at not getting caught. I imagine running into them at the grocery store or the mall and what I'd say, but I know I'd probably just walk away like I did with Jaden's mother. There's nothing to say that would make any of this make sense. Oliver asked me recently if I thought he'd ever be able to go to regular school again. I said maybe someday when he felt ready, but there was no rush. He said he knew other kids his age weren't as scared as him and wondered if he'd always be this way. I told him trauma changes people, but it doesn't have to define them, and he was still figuring out who he was going to be. He seemed to accept that answer even though I'm not sure I believe it myself. My mom helps out less now that Oliver's doing a bit better, but she comes over for dinner once a week. She and Oliver have gotten close in a way they weren't before all this happened. She taught him how to bake, and now he makes these elaborate desserts sometimes when he's feeling up to it. Last week he made lemon bars and brought some to Dr. Monroe as a thank you. She apparently got a little teary and said she'd treasure them. The nightmares still happen, but less frequently. Maybe twice a week now instead of every night. Oliver has a weighted blanket and a white noise machine and Scout curled up against him. When he does wake up crying, I hear him through the wall and go sit in his doorway until he falls back asleep. We don't talk about it in the morning unless he wants to. Most days he doesn't. I'm still angry about all of it. The school's failure, the district's indifference, the legal system's limitations, my own choices that I replay endlessly. Dr. Monroe says trauma affects parents too, and I should probably deal with that. She's probably right, but I don't have the energy. All my energy goes to keeping myself together enough to take care of Oliver and work enough hours to pay our bills and maintain some version of a life. Sometimes I see kids Oliver's age at the park or the store laughing with their friends and doing normal kid things, and I feel this crushing weight in my chest. That should be Oliver. He should be playing soccer and having sleepovers and worrying about homework instead of having panic attacks and nightmares. I stole that from him by not protecting him better. By believing bruises came from soccer and stomach aches were just stomach aches. By trusting a system that was fundamentally broken. Oliver says he doesn't blame me, but I blame myself enough for both of us. I keep a folder in my desk with all the documentation from his case. Every email to the school, every incident report, every medical record, every legal document. I don't know why I keep it. Maybe as evidence that I tried even though I failed. Maybe as a reminder to never trust institutional promises of safety again. Maybe because throwing it away would feel like saying it wasn't important when it's the most important thing that's ever happened to us. We're supposed to follow up with Dr. Monroe next month to reassess Oliver's treatment plan. She said we're looking at years, not months, for his recovery, and even then he might always have some level of anxiety and hypervigilance. She said the goal isn't to erase what happened, but to help Oliver integrate it into his story without it controlling his whole life. I'm not sure what that looks like practically, but I'm trying to believe it's possible. Last week Oliver laughed at something Scout did. Not a small polite laugh, but a real deep belly laugh that lasted several seconds. I hadn't heard him laugh like that since before everything happened. It shocked both of us, and then he laughed again, more quietly this time, almost embarrassed. I didn't say anything about it because I didn't want to make it weird, but I thought about that laugh all day at work. That one moment of him forgetting to be afraid. I'm writing this at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. because I can't sleep. Oliver's asleep in his room with Scout. My mom's home in her own bed. The house is quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Tomorrow I work a 10-hour shift and Oliver has therapy at 3. We'll figure out dinner and homework and bedtime and then do it all again the next day. This is our life now. It's not the life I planned, but it's the one we're living. We survived, and that has to count for something.